points. So we think strike action is important. At the same time, we have to build locally anti-cuts committees which organise local demonstrations, protests, lobbies of councils and so on. And we will also need to link together those anti-cuts committees. Again, if you look back to the poll tax, it wasn't simple in the first instance. In fact, there were lots of different campaigns at first, particularly in Scotland where it was introduced a year earlier. But in the end, we managed to bring together 2,000 local anti-poll tax unions, that's what they were called, to found the Anti-Poll Tax Federation, which then coordinated the national struggle. And we will have to take similar initiatives this time. We're not at that stage yet. We don't have 2,000 local anti-cuts unions yet, although we're into the hundreds. But it's very important. The Shop Stewards Network has called a conference in January to try and bring together those different anti-cuts unions to begin to coordinate that struggle nationally. Now, the other points I want to make are on the question of a political alternative to the Axe Main. Because New Labour, who are another big business party, who accept the market, have made it absolutely clear that they also favour big cuts in public services. They say they would go slower than the Tories, and no doubt they would. It would be difficult to go faster than the Tories in the terms of the amount of cuts that have been carried out. But Darling, the Chancellor, stood in the last election with the slogan that they would carry out worse cuts than Thatcher, and that says it all really about what they would do. At local level, there are Labour councils who are saying that they are going to oppose the cuts. Now let's be clear about this. We're not in the Labour Party. We're long since left the Labour Party. I think it's a party of big business these days. But where Labour councils do that, or Green councils, or even Lib Dem councils, whatever our other differences, we welcome their opposition to the cuts with open arms. And we would be prepared to try and mobilise the kind of movement we had in Liverpool, and to organise a mass movement in defence of those councillors that refuse to carry out the cuts. But it's got to be refusing to carry out the cuts, not just in words, but in deeds. The reality at the moment is that Labour councils are doing the same as Derek Hatton talked about in that film. They're saying, we've got no choice, it's our job. We've got to wield this axe that the Tories are giving us. We don't like it, but if we don't do it, we'll be breaking the law. Well, Liverpool City Council took a decision, like Poplar did 2 generations earlier here in London, to say it's better to break the law than to break the poor, and that they would implement the programme that they were elected on. And the programme of socialism still stands in bricks and mortar in Liverpool. 5,000 council houses were built, 6 new leisure centres, because they were prepared to fight and defy the Tory government. They mobilised regional or city-wide general strikes in support of their programme. And as a result of that, the Tory government were forced to concede and to give them more money. This praise comes from Liverpool from very odd places. Simon Jenkins, who's a right-wing Evening Standard journalist, had an article on housing and the grotesque nature of inner-city council estates and architecture and so on in the Evening Standard last week. But in it, just as an aside, he says, the most distinctive feature of the militant left's rule of Liverpool in the 80s was its impact on urban renewal. Responding to the public, the council smashed most of the hated tower blocks to the ground and left neighbourhood groups to plan their replacement. The result was no more decks, stairwells and broken lifts. Instead, people decided to revert to terraced houses with back and front gardens, though he doesn't say that, like those taken from them in the 60s. It was an object lesson in democracy. Well, he's right. That's what Liverpool Council did, and they were prepared to break the law in order to do that. If today's Labour councils are prepared to do the same, then we will back them fully, but we don't accept the idea that you're against cuts because you say you are, if you're then going in to the council chamber and voting to carry them out. And by the way, they will say we can't do it, we've got no choice. And it's true, in the end, the Liverpool councils were surcharged, were fined large amounts of money and were thrown out of office. But every single penny of those surcharges were raised by the Labour movement, so the councils themselves didn't have to pay them because of what Liverpool Council had achieved. But there's another side to it. Liverpool, with the honourable exception of Lambeth, who also stood firm, were left alone. There were 20 other Labour councils who promised to stand and fight against the Tories. They were led by such determined fighters for the working classes, David Blunkett, Ken Livingstone. So perhaps it's not a surprise what happened, but when it came to the crunch, every single one of them backed out. And as a result, Liverpool was left isolated. But if they had stood firm, not only would Liverpool not have been surcharged, but the Tory government would have been swept from office. And so there's the potential for a similar movement today. And by the way, these days, even the surcharge has been abolished. So never mind being prepared to go to prison, as Terry Fields did during the poll tax movement, along with hundreds of other anti-poll tax activists. Councillors these days can't even be surcharged for standing up, yet they're still not prepared to do it. So, where the councillors are all voting for the cuts, which has been the case up and down the country so far, what response do we give? The anti-cuts movement is going to have to say, if you're not prepared to fight on our behalf, stand aside and let us stand in the elections and fight. Next May's elections, the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, which is the Socialist Party, the Railway Workers Union and others, are planning to stand candidates across the country, and we want to encourage as many anti-cuts activists as possible to stand to put a clear anti-cuts policy everywhere that cuts have been carried out. And we'll see what stage the movement is at. But those candidates could achieve surprising successes. There are some people who think, because the Tories are back in power, you've got no choice but to accept just voting Labour in the hope of getting rid of the Tories and ending up with a slightly littler axe. But actually, if you look back to the poll tax, in 1992, Tommy Sheridan, who you saw in that film, got 18% of the vote in the general election, standing from nowhere. He'd never stood in elections before. He was elected to the council from his prison cell. And he did that in Scotland, where, believe me, wanting to get rid of the Tories and feeling you had to vote Labour to get rid of the Tories was probably stronger than it has ever been anywhere in history. But nonetheless, there were a lot of people who thought, well, we want rid of the Tories, but it was the Labour council who came and took our goods out of our house because we didn't pay the poll tax. So we'd rather have a fighter, and were prepared to vote for Tommy Sheridan at that time. So that question of an electoral alternative is very important. Now, I've run out of time, but I just have to say a couple more sentences, because there's no doubt if we organise a big enough movement, it will be possible to force this government to retreat from the cuts. After all, they even dimly realise that themselves. If you read newspapers like the Sunday Times, the Financial Times, they're all talking about Plan B. And what they mean is when these cuts put the economy back into recession, which they will, not that it's hardly out of recession, and when there's a mass movement against them, and they hit an immovable wall, then they're going to have to come back and try and go about it another way.